we have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizen can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
War is ugly business, unless you're a businessman. Then, of course, war is great business. Do you know how many wars the United States has been involved in? Not just world wars or official wars, but interventions as well. From 1798 until 2022, the US military has been involved in 469 interventions. Now that is quite a bit over a 250-plus year lifespan that the country has existed. It's to be expected also, isn't it? Competition between nations isn't anything new and something everybody has lived through in one time or another. But what if you saw that half, yes, 50% of all of those conflicts the country has been integrated into have happened in the last 30 years, also resulting in the deaths of 11,250,000 men, women, and children. That's a staggering increase. It's a frightening statistic to consider, and it would lead one to believe that the world is losing its mind. However, there is still the issue of how did things get this out of hand? In a democracy, the majority rules, and without hesitation, most will choose peace over violence. The elected representatives amidst the wills of their voters too, that's what they say, and voters believe what they say. Otherwise, they wouldn't vote for them, right? There is a lot of money tied into war. The defense budget of the United States for the year 2024 was passed at a record-breaking amount just shy of $900 billion. To put it into perspective, the average cost of a home in the United States in 2022 was roughly $500,000, with the defense budget of just 1 year that could buy 1.8 million homes for the homeless, with change to spare. Furthermore, half of that $900 billion budget goes to the private sector. That area excludes the Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, Space Force, the Pentagon, the CIA, the DIA, the NSA, the FBI, etc. The rest of it goes to companies like Lockheed, RTX, General Dynamics, Boeing, and a number of others. But what about other countries? The next largest defense budget comes from China at $230 billion. To get near the budget of the United States, we must take the next 10 ranked countries and combine their budgets. But still, even with China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, the UK, Germany, France, South Korea, Japan, and Ukraine defense budgets put together, it's still just short of the United States defense budget at $849 billion. But why is the defense budget so high? To reiterate, there is a lot of money in weapons sales, not so much domestically when compared to the awesome size of the international arms trade. Despite the United States having laws against monopolies, there are only a handful of companies that supply armaments and equipment to defense services. And if you know you're the only supplier of something in a business transaction, then you have control over the price. Where else are they going to get what they need from? The privatization of national defense has led to several concerns regarding the potential for political corruption via lobbying or the recent trend of a revolving door policy. The concern arises from a private business with a lot of money going to see a congressman and wants a policy that might be in the interest of the company the lobbyist represents, but not necessarily the voters in a state or the entire country. It's not a bribe according to the legal definition, it's a contribution to the office of a representative in the hopes that they'll listen to what you have to say and act on your behalf. Okay, now keep in mind that we're talking about companies whose sole purpose of existing is to assist in war. What if they lobbied to, say, send Lockheed's ATACMS missiles to Ukraine? Well, the company would stand to make a lot of money on the transaction, having items sold and to be shipped for use. The representative gains a financial donor for possible re-election in their current position, and if the government rep gets the bill passed and sales are made, they might get another donation later or possibly a job offer in the company after leaving office. This last example is the revolving door policy mentioned earlier. It's not illegal to do these things, although it is highly suspicious and puts everybody at an arm's length sort of distance. Potentially, this can lead to what Eisenhower stated as the military-industrial complex, when war is the product being sold. How did war become such a lucrative business model in the American economy? To start with, we'll go back to the presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt and just before the United States became involved in World War II. While the Europeans were at war with Germany and Italy, America's allies needed weapons and lots of them. FDR started the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, which became the tool for Congress to sell or loan weapons or equipment to foreign allies. The problem with this on an international level, and something brought up by Representative James Wadsworth at the time, was that it could involve the country in a war it would otherwise not have been involved in. Despite what we're told by our leaders when arming a side in a war, that pretty much means we are involved and intervening. Assisting a country in a time of war, militarily, puts Americans in harm's way unnecessarily and creates excuses to sending troops over to take part in the fighting on ground level in the name of self-defense. This fighting means more profits for weapon makers, and not just weapon makers. Everybody from banks to energy companies, construction, even car manufacturers, oil and leather companies. DuPont made a fortune making parachutes and other items for troops in World War II, for example. You don't need to make weapons to profit from a war. And don't forget, those machines need millions of gallons of fuel and oil to function. With so many hands involved and interconnected, how could they keep the money going after the war ended? It's well documented during the Cold War that the USA and the Soviet Union were in an arms race out of fear that the other country might attack with a nuclear weapon or invade the other. This fear-mongering propaganda would last for near 3 generations and be hand-fed to the public. Although an ally against Nazi Germany, the Soviets were the boogeyman of the 50s up until the fall of the Berlin Wall. And this potential threat was just one excuse the defense sector needed to push for more military spending. Eisenhower's farewell address to the nation before handing off the Oval Office to John F. Kennedy was a warning to the public regarding corporate influence in the federal government. Eisenhower hoped that those who came after him would find a balance between defense and diplomacy. America has the most military bases around the globe. With at least 750 bases worldwide in 80 countries, the United States military is the most powerful force the world has ever seen, and costing the country $100 billion every year alone. Some of these bases were set up when there was an active campaign in the region, and the soldiers never left. Many of these foreign bases have also been used for operations in later conflicts. It's safe to assume that if Russia wanted to put up a base in the US, several citizens would take issue with that. Also, Congress and the President would view it as an occupation and demand Russia leave. What purpose does it serve the US to have bases in Germany or Japan? America is a long way from Japan and the Middle East. The argument then becomes that the US really doesn't need hundreds of bases in sovereign nations around the world. This grandstanding could very well contribute to the negative view people have in regions America is occupying. With the national debt going over $34 trillion, it's high time Americans start looking at where they focus their profits. The argument that says it's okay when we come into your house because we're the good guys and it's for our national defense is not going to work in a global economy. Often, bases are installed after a war to help with restructuring efforts and maintain some civil security, and in that instance, should be temporary. However, even today, Iraq is home to a few American military bases, and that war ended in 2011. Iraq is set up enough already to where it can take care of itself, and so there's really no reason for America to be over there any longer. Some view the bases in Syria as an affront to the independence of that nation, and we have seen a series of attacks happen on these bases that did not need to happen. The reason for America invading Iraq isn't, well, known publicly.
Right after 9/11, about 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who had used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." And you can hardly fault Iran because they're offering to do eye operations for Iraqis who need medical attention. That's not an offense that you can go to war over, perhaps, but it is an effort to gain influence. And the administration has stubbornly refused to talk with Iran about their perception, in part because they don't want to pay the price with their our U.S. domestic political base, the right-wing base, but also because they don't want to legitimate a government that they've been trying to overthrow. If you were Iran, you'd probably believe that you were mostly already at war with the United States anyway, since we've asserted that their government needs regime change. So, and we've asked Congress to appropriate $75 million to do it, and we are supporting terrorist groups, apparently, who are infiltrating and blowing up things inside Iran. And if we're not doing it, let's put it this way, we're probably cognizant of it and encouraging it.
The pretenses for it happening turned out to be misleading as well. Both Afghanistan and Iraq occurred closely to each other, but whereas a number of people were willing to fight al-Qaeda, many Americans wondered, why they were getting involved in Iraq at all. The enthusiasm just wasn't there and was predicated as being connected to the 9/11 attacks in 2001, which would later be found to be based on erroneous information. Al-Qaeda was the villain of the 2000s, but in the 1980s, the United States helped get Al-Qaeda to the position they hold. See, back then, Al-Qaeda was a rebel force fighting off the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, and with the help of American aid, they were able to win. They armed them, trained them, and financed them. They propped up an entity they would later be attacked by and go to war with. And as such, something very similar is happening again with Hamas and Israel.
I rise in opposition to this resolution, not because I am taking sides and picking who the bad guys are and who the good guys are, but I'm looking at this more from the angle of being a United States citizen, an American, and I think resolutions like this really do us great harm. In many ways, what's happening in the Middle East, and in particular with Gaza right now, we have some moral responsibility for both sides in a way, because we provide help and funding for both Arab nations and Israel. And so we definitely have a moral responsibility, and especially now today, the weapons being used to kill so many Palestinians are American weapons, and American funds essentially are being used for this. But there's a political liability which I think is something that we fail to look at, because too often there's so much blowback from our intervention in areas that we shouldn't be involved in. You know, Hamas, if you look at the history, you'll find out that Hamas was encouraged and really started by Israel, because they wanted Hamas to counteract Yasser Arafat. And you say, well, yeah, that was better then and served its purpose, but we didn't want Hamas to do this. So then we as Americans say, well, we have such a good system, we're going to impose this on the world. We're going to invade Iraq and teach people how to be Democrats. We want free elections. So we encourage the Palestinians to have a free election. They do, and they elect Hamas. So we first, indirectly and directly through Israel, help establish Hamas. Then we have election. Then Hamas becomes dominant, so we have to kill them. You know, it just doesn't make sense. During the 80s, you know, we were allied with Osama bin Laden. And we were contending with the Soviets. It was at that time our CIA thought it was good if we radicalized the Muslim world. So we financed the madrasa schools to radicalize the Muslims in order to compete with the Soviets. There's too much blowback. There's a lot of reasons why we should oppose this resolution. It is not in the interest of the United States. It's not in the interest of Israel either.
What doesn't help these interventions is when we have representatives actively pushing for military action or the assassination of foreign leaders. Whatever the costs, as Congressman Graham told CNN in an interview, saying the civilian casualties caused by Israeli forces in Gaza should be acceptable.
Is there a threshold for you, and do you think there should be one for the United States government, at which the U.S. would say, let's hold off for a second in terms of civilian casualties? Is there a point at which you would start to question?
No, if somebody asked us after World War II, is there a limit what you would do to make sure that Japan and Germany don't conquer the world? Is there any limit what Israel should do to the people who are trying to slaughter the Jews? The answer is no. There is no limit, but here's what you need to do. Be smart. Let's try to limit civilian casualties the best we can. Let's put humanitarian aid in areas that protect the innocent. I'm all for that, but this idea that Israel has to apologize for attacking Hamas, who's embedded with their own population, needs to stop. The goal is to destroy Hamas. Hamas is creating these casualties, not Israel.
Most of the weapons being used come from aid packages sent by the United States, paying with tax dollars to send bombs overseas that are being used to target combatants in a heavily populated and compacted civilian area. Surely Graham is aware of what winning by any means and no matter the cost of lives means. And if he isn't, then he has no standing to make decisions that result in anything related to war. During a vote for a ceasefire in Gaza with the on-again, off-again conflict between Palestinians and Israel, the United States stunningly voted no on trying to achieve any form of peace in the region. It has been very lucrative to the American defense companies whose products are sent overseas to Israel and Ukraine, and as such the United States government has no interest in ending any of these conflicts. The concept of profits in and of itself is to be expected in many fields during a time of war, to be sure. Obviously, when bombs are used, stockpiles need to be replenished, and thus orders are going to be placed, sales are made. However, these shocking increases in proxy wars suggest that war is being used as a means of profit itself. Thus, we need a constant string of wars to always make a profit. The problem with sending American-made weapons to a foreign country at war is that whoever the aggressor is seen as will know America is involved, and that they're also at war with the United States. It is also not conducive to any mediation towards peace, but rather making it exponentially worse, and possibly getting American troops involved in the conflict itself. How is it legal for a company to push war? How can Congress let that happen? How could we not know about it? The Lobbying Disclosure Act of 1995 requires lobbyists to report quarterly reports on what they spend on contributions to any government official or office. And with sites like Open Secrets, we now have convenient tables and searches showing what sort of donation money is being sent to candidates. And if you're wondering just how involved Lockheed is in lobbying or what type of bills they push for, even which congressman sponsored the bill on the floor, here's a list of all the recent bills they've been a part of. In 2010, the Supreme Court ruled in Citizens versus FEC that corporations have the same First Amendment rights as individuals in the country. This means that corporations can legally donate as an expression of free speech to any government official or office. The reasoning for passing this ruling was that Congress receives thousands of bills that cross their desk every year, and that it would be impossible to go over all of those and get them to the floor for a vote. So, companies like Lockheed, RTX, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, General Dynamics, and other major lobbying firms and corporate donations are made on our behalf. How nice of them. This opens a whole other mess of congressional corruption and scandal when introducing the idea of dark money to avoid filing finances through legal channels. And bribes don't always come in the form of donations. Recently, Senator Menendez was charged for accepting bribes of gold bars that were gifts when he visited Egypt. What's the connection to Egypt, though? Well, Menendez attempted to get Egypt an aid package of $1.5 billion, and with the sheer amount of money that goes through the defense sector, it's not outside the purview of suspicion that the increase in these wars might have ties with this form of corruption. The other part of this buying and selling of national and foreign influence involves stock holdings of congresspeople in regards to the decisions and policies they make supposedly for the good of the country. This is also legal for some reason. In 2021, Pelosi prohibited a stock trade ban for congressmen stating, "We are a free market economy." And she's right to some extent. but regular people who work outside of these positions don't receive government briefings of non-public information directly tied to the cost of stock. It opens the door to using the office as a means of capital gains rather than public service. It leads the way to temptation and greed. Why would they turn it down when it would help eliminate at least one avenue of potential corruption? Probably because they are also making money on it. You would think that passing something like this would help the credibility of the government representative, restore some confidence in their office, and show that yes, we can weed out corruption bit by bit. There would have to be a personal reason for doing so. It is documented with released financial statements showing senators such as Diana Harshberger and holding stock in RTX, one of the top military contractors in the United States. Lois Frankel of Florida also recently had made trades in the company. Several others, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, has also been found trading military contract stocks, just days before President Biden approved sales of Lockheed and RTX weaponry. These other senators and representatives hold similar investments at a time when President Biden is approving massive aid bills for Ukraine and Israel with weapons made by Lockheed and RTX, among others. That in turn means their investments will be worth more money. And so, it's no surprise that Congress almost unanimously passes these massive aid bills to conflict zones for the purpose of rearming an ally in a time of war, if only to keep the fight going. Formerly known as Raytheon, RTX had reported in their 2023 financial reports that they had made over $13 billion in profits. A major proponent of these profits are due to the continued support of foreign wars. Greg Hayes, the CEO of RTX, delivered an earnings report to investors where he eagerly notified them that increased U.S. funding for Israel will generate fresh contracts for missiles from the company's Raytheon division. So, we turned down peace talks. Also, there are elected officials pushing loudly for even more military action to be taken, all the while investing in companies who have government contracts paid for with tax dollars and produce the weapons. This is a problem. Oil companies stand to make profits, along with the defense sector, as Shell had made $9 billion despite sales from Russian oil dropping in Europe as they were heavily dependent on Russian petroleum imports. They sought alternative suppliers after the invasion of Ukraine and have had a hard time of it as of late. The American military is a large consumer of oil, of course. If you're worried about environmental damage to the planet, you'll be surprised to find out that the Department of Defense uses enough oil that it would rank in just behind Iraq and Sudan in consumption, putting it in the top 40 worldwide of oil consumption. After all, your naval aircraft carrier like a Nimitz holds up to 3 million gallons of gasoline for a full tank. Might be rather high with that carbon footprint, but it's fine, because they say so in the name of national defense. But defense against whom exactly? The ones we fund in the beginning? And for how much longer do we have to defend ourselves from the rest of the world? It's unfathomable, it seems, to even ponder on a what-if in how the world would react if America just stopped and left it alone. In the last 10 years, America has dropped tens of thousands of bombs and missiles all over the Middle East. This continued aggressive state of foreign policy will only serve to further ruin the country's standing with a growing global economy that may decide it doesn't want to deal with America any longer. All the while, the country is bleeding itself dry, financially, with overpriced equipment. It's damn near a Ponzi scheme, if there ever was one.
It wasn't always like this. The roots of the problem can be traced to 1993, when the Pentagon, looking to cut costs, urged defense companies to merge. 51 major contractors consolidated to 5 giants.
The only feasible purpose this can serve is to the benefit of those who stand to profit from wars and interventions in the first place. which it seems to include top energy companies, military contractors, and high-ranking members of the American government who refuse to seriously vote on banning insider trading in the stock market. You'd almost think with the drop in military recruitment that this heightened suspicious behavior might have something to do with that. But it's alarming just how little most people know regarding these correlated problems facing their nation today and probably the last 80 years. I had wanted to get a younger perspective to see where Gen Z stood on political issues today. I went to a local university to collect what issues regarding voting were on their minds. Also, I wanted to know whether they even felt voting had any meaning anymore. I had initially believed that a majority of the youth would not be so inclined as to partake in politics or dip their toes in the muck, but upon looking at US Census data, found that the 2020 election between Trump and Biden saw a rise in voters in their age group. Marvelous. My hopes were that so long as more and more of the youth were becoming involved with controlling their environment through politics, that there was some hope to ending the military-industrial complex by simply educating the youth about how harmful it is to themselves and others abroad. The 2020 election had seen 50% of eligible voters in the United States turn out, when for a good while it lingered just above 40%. This is a positive change to more young adults becoming involved with their local community, and the biggest thing Gen Z is looking for is unfiltered and honest information simply to make the best informed decision. In my talks with the students, a lot of them voiced that there just wasn't enough reliable information on candidates who were running. Gen Z knows the candidates aren't perfect, and like most people with common sense, roll their eyes whenever someone starts telling stories. And they suspect that the candidates don't have the background to back up what they say they are going to do or push for if elected. It's understandable also when corporate media like CNN and Fox are so polarizing in their coverage. What doesn't help either is bad information can come from sources outside of mass media as well. It's difficult to receive all pieces of information if we stay in an echo chamber or allow others to think for us. And it becomes easier for us to be misinformed or led astray if we don't take some personal responsibility to verify what's being said to us. In short, check it out for yourself before wholeheartedly agreeing with somebody else's assertions. That means reading and researching. Corporations have talking points and agendas of their own as well. That's not to say everything is a lie, though, and that's where discernment comes into play. It was called out publicly, but ABC had put out a story of a supposed Syrian attack on Allied forces. What it showed was a barrage of gunfire and explosions in the middle of the night, but it was later pointed out that it was doctored footage of a gun range in Kentucky. It's unclear where the footage came from, and it's obvious ABC didn't bother to clear the information either before running with the story, as they later had to apologize for airing it. That's not to say it was deliberate in this case, but how even major media corporate news can be highly inaccurate, as we've discovered from the bumbling excuses for the Second Iraq War. Propaganda can come from foreign nations as well, to influence the view of the public, to call for an outcry of support for the cause. If we are going to consume news and information without some homework, we'll be led by the hand for whatever source we use to get our infotainment from. There are also a few who don't feel their vote has any meaning anymore. They may not know the nuts and bolts or extent of the corruption that has them so dejected against the system, but they know the system is corrupt, and this keeps them from taking part in the voting process. Yet what's important to keep in mind is that we don't have to choose a lesser of two evils. This sort of system cannot be simply overtaken in a violent way, and apart from a nationwide moratorium where nobody goes to work or school, it falls on each of us to take some form of action by letting our government know our position, that we vote while we still have the ability to. It might fall on us to run for office ourselves locally, even if that's what it takes. Resorting to a civil war or rebellion will only continue to profit the ones already making money on the state of the world. Not voting is also a form of allowing things to stay as they are, if not get worse. Part of the discourse process is disagreement, and within that discussion and opposing views, we can find mutual ground to come together on. Without speaking to each other, however, we'll never find that middle path. We'll never have a perfect hero who will solve all of our problems for us, especially in Washington. We can start being involved in our local community and paying more attention to, say, who is running for office, doing our own research or finding better sources of information, if nothing else. In doing so, we can take a large step to limit the corruption in our institutions. It's a bit folly to think it will be perfect, but it's got to be better than endless wars. It'll be better when we stop being gullible and take charge of our own future. If we don't make a decision, then corporations will do it for us. Major General Smedley Butler talked about the military-industrial complex before World War II was the highest decorated veteran that ever served. He spoke of his service as nothing more as being a strong-arm man for big business and said war is a racket. With the interwoven dependency across a number of corporations in regards to war being beneficial to them, it paints a volatile picture of monopolized commerce in a so-called free market. The illogical decisions made in continuing proxy war after proxy war serves no purpose to the American citizen. It only finances those who buy into it, who propagate it, and seek it being maintained as such. America is militarizing itself into financial ruin, pushing the international community away, and in turn, losing its position as a partner in the world. The system has holes that are flooding the ship with unsustainable debt without any benefit to the taxpayer. America's military is spread out all over the place, and its government needs to stop trying to get everybody else to bending the knee. The saying "pride before the fall" means the same as being self-destructive when others are trying to help you because we're too proud to admit we're wrong. Even the divisions we have in society that are bottomless separate us from even talking to one another. There's always something we'll disagree on, like how a nation is ran, for example, but that doesn't mean that countries like the United States and Russia cannot work together on resolving all of these military conflicts peacefully. But given the amount of money being made on keeping us in angst with one another and the world, it's clear that any change will have to come from the ground and up the ladder. We want to help one another. Any human being with compassion does. Falling into a pit of despair, we look for reasons to dig in deeper, and we can feel the weight of thinking we have no control, which keeps us in a state of not acting. Perhaps because it is easier to do nothing. It's easy to not care or bother with trying to fix any problem. Allowing despair to overtake empathy, we allow our future to continue to rot like an untended garden. Others who do not have our best interests at heart will decide for us when the majority falls silent what is best for you and me. You'll find as you go through life that not acting on something will leave you with more regret than having tried and failed. President John F. Kennedy had said once that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. We cannot fix the military-industrial complex in one fell swoop, but after taking enough steps towards a brighter and less bloody future, eventually we will reach our desired destination. We can not only help ourselves, but those who will be here after we're long gone. The next generation, the youth of the United States, have the power to make a change for the better. And not only will their children benefit, but the world entirely. With us older folks, it falls on us to lead by example, to encourage and provide that hope. This positive change is not going to come from the ones currently in charge. One solution could be to implement what some states do by allowing voters to issue recall votes to remove members from office after 6 months and then hold another election. Perhaps this should be applied in every state, to every government position, to remind our government who is in charge. Why not ban foreign policy makers from insider stock trading while in the position ourselves? We could also push for term limits on governors and Senate seats to end career politicians. There are things we can put at the forefront of elections that candidates need to take seriously before losing what morsel of credibility they have left. We can support the victims of these wars by ending the selling of weapons to foreign nations. It's false to believe this method of profiting must continue. If we use voting through a true majority to stop this insane idea of using the United States government as an arms dealer for coups around the world, we can bring the planet itself towards a more stable place of existence. Let's back candidates who support ending insider trading, rampant lobbying, funding foreign wars, lifelong politicians, and closing foreign bases, because these are the elements that contribute to the military-industrial complex. Limiting the temptation, it's something to wonder how many would decide not to run for office at all.